The year 1900, a pivotal moment in history marking the transition from one century to the next. A new century was dawning, bringing with it the promise of progress and the shadow of uncertainty. It was a time of great promise and even greater uncertainty. The world was on the brink of monumental changes, both technological and social. For the Russian Empire, the 20th century began with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The vast expanse of the empire was a land of contrasts and contradictions. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov dynasty, had ascended to the throne in 1894. His reign was marked by a deep sense of duty and a belief in the divine right of kings. He inherited a vast empire, stretching from the icy plains of Siberia to the warm waters of the Black Sea. This immense territory was rich in natural resources and cultural diversity. Russia was a land of immense size and potential. Its landscapes were as varied as its people, from the bustling cities to the remote rural villages. However, it was also a land of deep divisions and simmering unrest. The gap between the rich and the poor was vast and growing. The Russian Empire was a society of stark contrasts. The opulence of the aristocracy was a world away from the harsh realities faced by the peasantry. The glittering wealth of the aristocracy stood in sharp contrast to the grinding poverty of the peasantry. While the elite enjoyed luxurious lifestyles, the majority of Russians struggled to survive. The vast majority of Russians were peasants, toiling on the land in conditions that had changed little for centuries. Their lives were marked by hard labor and limited opportunities. Meanwhile, the privileged few lived in a world of luxury and extravagance. Their lives were filled with opulent dinners, grand estates, and a sense of entitlement. They attended lavish balls, dined on caviar and champagne, and adorned themselves in jewels and furs. This stark disparity was a source of growing tension. The Tsar and his government seemed oblivious to the plight of the people. Their focus remained on maintaining their power and privilege. Nicholas II, a deeply conservative ruler, believed in the divine right of kings. He saw himself as the appointed guardian of the Russian Empire and its traditions. He was determined to uphold the autocracy. Any challenge to his authority was met with resistance. He resisted any calls for reform. The voices of those seeking change were often silenced or ignored. The Tsar's intransigence fueled the growing discontent among the populace. The people were becoming increasingly restless and disillusioned. The stage was set for revolution. The seeds of change had been sown, and the coming years would see the Russian Empire transformed in ways that few could have predicted. The chasm between the Tsar and his people was vast, a gulf that seemed insurmountable. The opulence of the Winter Palace stood in stark contrast to the dire poverty experienced by the majority of the Russian populace. Nicholas II, although a loving husband and father, remained aloof from the realities of his empire. His life was one of privilege and isolation, surrounded by the grandeur of the court and the comforts of his family. He seemed more interested in the minutiae of court life than in the pressing concerns of his subjects. The daily struggles of the common people were far removed from the lavish balls and intricate court ceremonies that occupied his time. His reign was marked by a series of blunders and miscalculations that further alienated the populace. The Tsar's inability to address the needs of his people led to widespread dissatisfaction and unrest. The disastrous Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 exposed the weaknesses of the Tsarist regime. The war, intended to bolster national pride, instead highlighted the inefficiencies and corruption within the military and government. Russia's defeat at the hands of Japan, a nation considered by many in Russia to be inferior, sent shockwaves through the empire. The loss was a national humiliation and a stark reminder of the Tsar's failed leadership. It shattered the myth of Russian invincibility and fueled the flames of discontent. The defeat undermined the Tsar's authority and emboldened his critics. The Revolution of 1905, a wave of mass political and social unrest that spread across the empire, shook the foundations of Tsarist rule. The unrest was a direct response to the failures of the Tsarist regime and the growing demand for change. Workers went on strike, peasants revolted, and students took to the streets, united in their opposition to the Tsarist regime, demanding better working conditions, land reforms, and political freedoms. The Tsar, faced with the specter of revolution, was forced to make concessions. His attempts to placate the masses were seen as a sign of weakness, but they were necessary to quell the immediate unrest. He issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and the establishment of a legislative assembly, the Duma. The manifesto was a significant step towards constitutional monarchy, but it was met with skepticism by many. These reforms, however, proved to be too little, too late. The promises of the October Manifesto were not fully realized, and the Tsar's reluctance to relinquish power became evident. The Tsar, determined to hold on to power, soon reneged on his promises. His actions betrayed the trust of the people and reignited the flames of revolution. The Duma was stripped of its power, and the Tsarist regime resorted to repression to silence its critics. The use of force to maintain control only deepened the divide between the Tsar and his people. The hopes for meaningful reform were dashed, leaving the populace disillusioned and angry. The Tsar's failure to address the root causes of discontent set the stage for further turmoil and ultimately, the fall of the Romanov dynasty. As the political climate darkened, a sinister figure emerged from the shadows: Grigori Rasputin. A self-proclaimed holy man with a reputation for debauchery and mysticism, Rasputin gained extraordinary influence over the royal family. He arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903 and quickly ingratiated himself with Tsarina Alexandra, the Tsar's wife. Alexandra, desperate to find a cure for her hemophiliac son Alexei, came to believe in Rasputin's healing powers. She saw him as a savior, a man sent by God to protect her son. The Tsarina's unwavering faith in Rasputin gave him unprecedented access to the corridors of power. Rasputin's influence over the royal family was disastrous. He interfered in government appointments, peddled his influence for personal gain, and discredited the monarchy with his scandalous behavior. Rumors of his sexual exploits and his alleged influence over the Tsarina spread like wildfire through the salons of St. Petersburg. Section 4, World War I, the Catalyst. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 proved to be the catalyst for the Russian Revolution. The war, which began as a conflict between major European powers, quickly escalated into a global confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences for many nations, including Russia. Eager to defend Serbia, a fellow Slavic nation, Tsar Nicholas II led his country into war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. This decision was driven by a sense of duty to protect Slavic interests and maintain Russia's influence in the Balkans. The decision proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The Russian military was not prepared for the scale and intensity of modern warfare, and the initial enthusiasm quickly turned to despair as the realities of the conflict set in. Russia, ill-prepared for a modern war, suffered a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the German army. The lack of adequate training, equipment, and leadership led to devastating losses on the battlefield. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed or wounded, and the economy was crippled by the war effort. The strain on resources and the loss of manpower had a profound impact on the nation's ability to sustain the war. The war exposed the incompetence and corruption of the Tsarist regime. The government's inability to effectively manage the war effort and address the needs of the people led to widespread disillusionment. It shattered any remaining illusions about the Tsar's competence as a ruler. The public's faith in the monarchy eroded as the war dragged on, and the calls for change grew louder. As the war dragged on, the Russian people grew weary of the endless bloodshed and the mounting economic hardships. The shortages of food and basic necessities, coupled with the constant threat of violence, created a sense of desperation among the population. The Tsar's decision to personally assume command of the army in 1915 proved to be a fatal mistake. By taking direct control, Nicholas hoped to inspire his troops and turn the tide of the war, but it only served to further alienate him from the people. It left the Tsarina and Rasputin in virtual control of the government in St. Petersburg. Their influence over political decisions and their perceived incompetence and corruption further fueled public outrage. This only served to further discredit the monarchy. The combination of military failures, economic collapse, and political mismanagement set the stage for the revolutionary movements that would soon sweep across Russia, ultimately leading to the fall of the Tsarist regime and the rise of the Soviet Union. Section 5, the February Revolution. By 1917, Russia was a powder keg waiting to explode. The war had ravaged the economy and food shortages plagued the major cities. The people were tired of war, tired of hunger, and tired of the Tsar. In February 1917, the long simmering discontent finally boiled over. On February 23, International Women's Day, textile workers in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, went on strike, demanding bread and an end to the war. They were soon joined by workers from other factories, and the strike quickly escalated into a general uprising. The Tsar, isolated at army headquarters, seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation. As the unrest spread, the Tsar ordered the army to restore order. However, the soldiers, many of whom were weary of war and sympathetic to the protesters, refused to fire on their fellow countrymen. Some units even joined the revolutionaries. The Tsarist regime, abandoned by its own troops, began to crumble.